The researcher was 43 years old, practical by nature and not given to sentiment. He had driven out from Lincoln that morning with a notebook, a thermometer, and the kind of measured skepticism that serious academic work requires. The year was 1941. The structure he was looking for was barely visible above the flat Nebraska earth, a slight mound of sod, a crooked chimney pipe, a ramp descending into the ground like a throat swallowing itself. He went down, his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Stone walls, a low ceiling of cottonwood beams solid after 58 years, a sleeping platform against the far wall, its wood worn smooth by decades of use, a firebox in the northwest corner, and from its opening a row of clay tiles disappeared into the earthen floor at a slight downward angle, traveling 14 feet toward a chimney shaft on the opposite side of the room. The researcher knelt. He pressed his palm flat against the floor. He held it there. Then he lifted his hand and looked at it as though confirming what his skin had just told him. Warm. The floor was warm, not merely not cold warm. On a November morning in 1941, with no fire having burned in this place for years, the earth beneath this floor was releasing heat, like a body releasing breath. 51 degrees, his thermometer would confirm, the same temperature the record said it had held in the winter of 1883. He opened his notebook. He wrote one sentence before anything else. Exactly as designed. Then he sat back on his heels in the dim underground space, and he thought about the woman who had built this. A woman who had been 62 years old, recently widowed, penniless, and alone. A woman who had arrived at this exact piece of ground with $9 in a dead man's knowledge, and not a single person in the world who believed she would survive the winter. He thought about what it must have taken. Then he closed his notebook, climbed the ramp back into the morning light, and drove back to Lincoln to write the paper that would describe what he had found. He would title it plainly. He was a practical man. But for the rest of his life, when people asked him about the most remarkable thing he had encountered in 30 years of fieldwork, he would not mention the paper. He would describe a warm floor in an empty room, and he would say, "You cannot understand it until you know the story of how it came to be there." The story begins in the spring of 1883. Dietrich Voss died on a Tuesday in April, the way strong men sometimes do, suddenly without warning, with no time to say the things that needed saying. He was working the south field when his heart simply stopped. He was 64 years old. He had been a farmer by necessity and an engineer by nature, a man who read books about Roman construction when the other men in Elkhorn County read seed catalogs, who spent evenings sketching heating systems in the margins of ledger paper while the household accounts went unfiled. His neighbors thought he was peculiar. His wife thought he was extraordinary. Erna Voss had married Dietrich 40 years earlier in a small Lutheran ceremony in Omaha, and in those 40 years she had learned to see the world the way he saw it, not as a collection of obstacles, but as a collection of problems waiting for the right solution. He used to say one thing to her more than anything else: "The earth never lies, Erna. People will, but the earth never lies." She understood what he meant now more than she ever had when he was alive. The bank came within 3 weeks of Dietrich's death. The farm carried debts he had managed quietly for years without troubling her, and without him managing them, they collapsed like a wall without mortar. The land, the equipment, the livestock. All of it settled accounts she had not known existed. She was left with the contents of the house, a small amount of cash that the lawyers described as negligible, and the problem of where to go next. She had one living relative she could ask. Louisa Brandt was Dietrich's younger sister, a gentle woman, soft-spoken with tired eyes and hands always a little too red from work. Louisa had married Gerhard Brandt 12 years earlier, and Gerhard was a wheat farmer with a wide back, a loud voice, and the particular confidence of a man who had built something solid and did not intend to share it unnecessarily. He had 6 children from his first marriage. He looked at the world the way a man looks at arithmetic, always counting, always calculating, always assessing what things cost. Erna arrived at the Brandt farmhouse in late August with a canvas bag and a trunk of Dietrich's books. Louisa opened the door with the expression of a woman who wanted to be generous, but had already been told how much generosity she was permitted. The arrangement lasted 9 days. Gerhard said very little during those 9 days. He watched Erna move through his house, cooking without being asked, mending without being thanked, disappearing quietly when he burned a room. He watched the way his children spoke to her, the way she answered their questions with patience and made them laugh at the supper table. He watched all of it and calculated. On the morning of August 28th, He called Erna to the front of the house. Louisa stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. She stood there the entire time and did not move. Gerhardt placed $9 on the table between them. He did not look away from her face when he spoke, which was the one thing she would remember most clearly in the years that followed. Not shame, not apology, not even cruelty precisely. Just arithmetic. Just the face of a man delivering a conclusion he had already reached. Dietrich died in debt and left you nothing. You are nobody's burden but your own. Erna picked up the $9. She took the wool blanket from the chair beside the door, the one she had brought herself. She took the clothes she was wearing. The trunk of books she left behind because she could not carry it, and Gerhardt did not offer to help. She walked out the door and down the dirt road and did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back changes nothing and costs everything. Elkhorn, Nebraska had 212 residents in the summer of 1883. It had a church, a general store, a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Prentice, and the particular social machinery of a small frontier town, which is to say that information moved faster than wagons and slower than kindness, and that the story of who you were was often decided by someone else before you arrived to tell it yourself. Gerhard Brandt had been in Elkhorn the previous Saturday. By the time Erna walked into town on the afternoon of August 28th, the version of her story that mattered had already been told. She did not know this yet. She would piece it together from the way faces changed when she gave her name, the way conversations stopped, and did not resume the way curtains shifted in windows as she passed. Mrs. Prentice answered the door of the boarding house and shook her head before Erna finished her first sentence. "I've heard about your situation," she said. The word situation carried the weight of everything it was meant to carry. "I can't take in strays. It's bad for business." The hotel had no work. The general store needed nothing. 3 farms within walking distance sent her away with the particular cruelty of doors closed just slowly enough that you cannot pretend they were closed by accident. By evening, Erna had walked to every place in Elkhorn where a 62-year-old woman with $9 and no references might reasonably hope for work or shelter. Every door had answered. Every answer was the same. She sat on a fence post at the edge of town as the sun dropped toward the horizon and thought about what she had, which required very little time. $9, a wool blanket, the clothes on her back, and 40 years of listening to a man explain the world in terms of problems and solutions. She was exhausted. Her feet hurt. Her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. But beneath the exhaustion and the shaking, there was something else, something older and quieter that did not have a name exactly, but felt like the part of her that Dietrich had spent 40 years talking to. The part that looked at an empty field and thought about what it could become. She started walking south, 4 miles outside of Elkhorn on a quarter section of land that nobody had claimed because the soil was poor and the location was isolated, and there was nothing about it that suggested usefulness to anyone who looked at it with practical eyes. Erna Voss stopped walking. She stood in the late afternoon light and looked at what was around her. Prairie grass running to the flat horizon. Sandy loam beneath the sod, she could see it at the edge of a small erosion cut the kind of soil that was easy to dig. A creek 2 miles east, the slight natural depression in the land that would protect a structure from the northwest wind. She heard Dietrich's voice clearly. Not imagination exactly, more like memory that had learned to speak at the right moment. You see what's there, not what you wish was there. That's the first thing, then you work with what's there. That's the second thing. $2 for a spade. $3 for 20 clay drainage tiles, the kind farmers use for field drainage, 6 inches in diameter, 12 inches long. $1 for a small iron cooking grate. That left $3 for food. Barely enough. But barely enough was not the same as nothing. Barely enough was a place to start. She set down the blanket, sat on the ground, and began to think. The system Dietrich had described to her over the years, always in the margins of conversations, always with that particular excitement he got when an idea pleased him, was ancient. The Romans had called it the hippocaust, hot air from a fire traveling through channels beneath the floor, warming the stone and earth above it before escaping through a chimney. The floor itself became the heater. The earth itself held the warmth. He had tested a version of it once in their chicken coop 15 years ago, a flue running beneath the roosting platform. Exhaust heat from a small fire warming the floor before escaping through a makeshift chimney. It had worked remarkably well. She remembered standing in the coop on a January morning with the temperature outside below zero, and the birds calm on their warm platform, and Dietrich kneeling beside the firebox with the look he wore when the world confirmed what he had believed about it. The exhaust from a cooking fire is still hot enough, 300 degrees, sometimes more, to warm clay and stone before it escapes. We throw that heat away every time we cook. Every meal, every morning, we throw heat into the sky for nothing. She had built her cooking fires for 40 years without thinking about where the heat went. She was thinking about it now. The Earth at 5 feet depth maintained a consistent temperature regardless of surface conditions, somewhere around 50 degrees winter and summer both. A structure built into the Earth would hold that baseline without any fire at all. Add a cooking fire whose exhaust traveled through 14 feet of buried clay before leaving through a chimney heating tiles in stone along the entire length of that journey, and the sleeping surface above those tiles would reach 80 degrees or more. Free heat. Heat from fires you needed to cook anyway. Nothing wasted. She would build the firebox in the northwest corner so the prevailing wind would draw smoke toward the chimney rather than back into the room. She would set the tiles at a 1-inch drop per foot, shallow enough for the smoke to travel slowly, transferring heat to the clay rather than rushing through. She would carry river stones from the creek 2 miles east to lay above the tiles. Stone held heat the way earth holds memory, slowly absorbed, slowly released, patient and faithful through the long dark hours. She had never built anything like this. She was 62 years old, recently widowed, sitting on the ground in a field 4 miles from the nearest door that had not been closed in her face. "This is my home," she said to the empty air. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her the way certain truths do, quietly, without announcement, as though they had been waiting a long time for the moment to arrive. She began digging on the morning of September 1st. The prairie sod was the first enemy. It was thick and matted and interconnected in ways that made it nearly impenetrable, a century of grass roots woven together into something closer to rope than soil. Erna chopped at it with the spade edge, broke it into blocks, hauled each block up out of the growing pit, and stacked it along the perimeter. She would use those blocks later for the walls. Nothing wasted. She had learned that from the man who had taught her to see the world as a collection of problems waiting for solutions. Beneath the sod, the sandy loam was easier. It gave way to the spade with the steady resistance of something that could be persuaded. She dug. She carried. She climbed in and out of the deepening pit until her legs shook on the ladder and her shoulders burned with every movement, and the blisters on her palms tore open and bled into the spade handle. She had worked hard in her life. 40 years of farming teaches a body its own particular endurance. But she had never dug into the earth by herself without help, without anyone to spell her when her arms gave out. On the first evening, she built a small fire from dried grass and one of the scraps of cottonwood she had gathered from the ground near the creek bank, boiled water in the small tin pot she had carried from Louisa's house, and drank it hot while her hands shook and her back held its pain like a debt. She slept in a shallow depression beside the pit, wrapped in the wool blanket. The stars were very sharp. The prairie wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. On the first day after breaking through 2 feet of sod, her spade struck something hard at 18 inches below the surface. She knelt. She used her fingers, brushing aside loose soil in careful movements, the way you move when you are not sure what you are about to find. The object was small, metal, deliberately placed, a tin box, small, rusted, sealed with the rust of years. She pried it open with the edge of the spade. Inside, folded tight and slightly damp from decades in the earth, was a piece of paper covered in handwriting. She recognized the handwriting before she could read a word of it. The tall, slanted letters, the way the lowercase g curled back on itself. The particular pressure of a pen held by a left-handed man who had learned to write right-handed and never fully resolved the tension between them. Dietrich's handwriting. Her husband had been here, on this exact piece of ground. He had buried something here and never told her about it. Her hands were trembling, and it was not from exhaustion. The ink had bled. The damp had done its work over time, and most of the words were illegible, bleeding into each other, washing into gray smears where the meaning used to be. She could make out individual letters in places, fragments of sentences in others, but nothing she could read as whole thought. The paper itself was fragile, threatening to tear at the edges where her fingers touched it. She set it on a flat stone in the afternoon sun where the light and air would reach it. She stared at it for a longer moment. What had Dietrich been planning? When had he come here? What had he meant to build on this ground that death had stolen the chance to build? She did not have answers. Not yet. The paper needed time she could not give it. She wrapped the tin box in a corner of her blanket to keep it dry, placed it where it would stay safe, and picked up the spade. Winter would not wait for answers. By the fifth day, she had not eaten in 2 days. The rabbit she had caught on day 3, 3 pounds, caught in the bent willow snare her husband had shown her how to make 30 years ago in a different life, was long finished. The wild turnips from the creek bank were bitter and fibrous and not enough to call food. Her body was failing in small specific ways, the gray edges at the corners of her vision. When she stood too quickly, the trembling in her hands that didn't stop even when they were warm, the way her knees had stopped being reliable. She was 62 years old and starving in an open field, and the nearest person who might care was 12 miles away and married to the man who had put her here. She set more snares. She waited. She dug. On the sixth morning, Sigrid Halve appeared. She was 71 years old, and she walked with a cottonwood cane in the unhurried certainty of someone who had survived the blizzard of 1873 and the grasshopper plague of 1874 and the drought years in between, and had concluded that the world's attempts to finish her were merely inconvenient. She lived alone in a sod house 3 miles from Erna's claim. She had heard the talk in Elhorn, the widow living in a hole in the ground. Most people were laughing. Sigrid was not. She walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. Erna looked up, a woman in her 60s with bloody rags wrapped around her hands, dirt on her face, hollow cheeks, and eyes that had stopped looking like the eyes of someone who expected rescue. "You're building floor heating," Sigrid said, not a question. "My husband described the principle. Hot exhaust through buried clay channels beneath a sleeping platform. The smoke heats the tile heats the earth heats the surface above it." Sigrid was quiet for a moment, looking at the clay tiles stacked under cloth near the wall of supplies. Then she looked at Erna with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite respect, but something in between the two. "Your husband spoke about this," she said finally, "at the Norwegian church social. Years ago, people thought he was a fool." She paused. "I didn't think he was a fool." She set the clay pot she had been carrying on the ground beside the pit. Porridge, still warm from her stove. Then she looked at the tile arrangement and shook her head. "Your joints are too wide. Clay mud won't hold if you don't mix sand 2 parts clay to 1 part sand. Let it cure 3 days before you run heat through it, or the whole thing cracks." Erna stared at her. "I'm old," Sigrid said. "Not useless. Eat the porridge. I'll come back Thursday." She turned and walked away across the prairie without looking back. Erna climbed out of the pit. She ate the porridge so fast she burned her tongue. It was the best thing she had tasted since April. Then she adjusted the tile joints exactly as Sigrid had instructed, remixed the mortar at the right ratio, and kept working. Sigrid would come back on Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She would bring small things, food 1 week, a candle the next, a length of cloth for mending. She would inspect the work and correct what needed correcting. She would stay no longer than necessary and offer no comfort beyond the practical. But she would come back, and in the particular arithmetic of Erna's situation, that counted as everything. The pit deepened through September. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3. The pit became a trench. The trench became a room. Erna hauled earth and cut sod blocks and built walls and shaped a roof from cottonwood poles dragged from a collapsed fence a mile east. She carried river stones from the creek in a cloth sack across her shoulders, 20 trips, 300 pounds total, her shoulders burning on every return uphill, her legs threatening to give out on the slopes. She built the entrance as a sloped ramp descending into the pit, a natural cold trap where frigid air would settle and pool at the bottom rather than flowing into the living space. She built the firebox with flat creek stones positioned so that the opening faced into the clay channel, and every draft of air from the fire would push smoke down into the tile system rather than into the room. She sealed every joint in the clay channel with the 2-to-1 mortar smoothed and tamped and allowed to cure 3 full days as Sigrid had instructed. The town came to look in early October. Mrs. Prentice organized it the way she organized most things that kept Elhorn's social machinery turning smoothly. She mentioned at the general store that someone ought to check on that poor Voss woman, and within an hour 5 people were walking out to the claim, bringing nothing, offering nothing, wearing the particular expression that passes for Christian concern in a small town when curiosity is the actual motive. They stood at the entrance ramp and peered down. Earthen walls sod-lined, a sleeping platform of salvaged wood, a firebox with clay tiles disappearing into the floor at a precise angle, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and something that was either poverty or ambition depending on who was smelling it. Mrs. Prentice straightened up and said it loud enough for her voice to carry across the flat prairie. "Lord have mercy, the woman is living in a grave." The name spread through Elhorn by evening. Some people called it Voss's Folly. Others just called it the grave. A boy from the general store rode out on a horse 3 days later to inform Erna that Mr. Whitfield had marked the location on the map he kept behind the counter, marked it with her name in a small cross beside it, like a headstone for someone not yet dead. Erna did not respond to this information. She had sod blocks to stack. She found Flint on the 12th of October. She had gone to Elhorn's rubbish dump east of town to scavenge for nails and wire, both useful, both free, both available in the discarded machinery of a town that threw away more than it realized. The dump was where Elhorn sent its broken things. And on the edge of a heap of rusted cans, a dog was lying. Brown and gray medium build, one ear standing and one folded over. Thin enough that his ribs made their own argument. He had been there long enough to stop expecting anyone to come back for him, but not long enough to stop watching. He looked at Erna. She looked at him. "I can barely feed myself," she said. He thumped his tail once against the frozen ground. She walked away. He followed, limping on his left front leg, moving with the determination of an animal that had decided something without consulting her. She walked faster. He limped faster. She stopped and turned around. He sat down and looked at her with brown eyes that held no accusation, only patience, as though he had all the time in the world to wait for her to arrive at the right decision. She had named things her whole life: plants, calves, problems. She named them because Dietrich had taught her that naming something was the first step toward understanding it. She named this dog Flint because she had survived by striking sparks from stone, and because the mite had the same quality, hard and patient and capable of producing warmth from nothing. He ate the rabbit bones she could not crack for marrow. He slept beside the entrance ramp and growled with quiet authority at anything that came close. On the first night, he lay down beside the firebox and released a sigh of such absolute contentment that Erna laughed. The sound startled her, coming out of her mouth unexpectedly louder than she had intended. She had not heard her own laughter in weeks, maybe longer. Flint looked up at the sound, thumped his tail, and put his head back down. Tobias Krell appeared in mid-October with a set of iron brackets he claimed were surplus from the forge. He was 19 years old, Swedish by heritage, with shoulders already wider than most grown men's, and a habit of looking at structural problems with the same focused attention that older men reserved for weather. He said very little. He installed the brackets, checked the chimney connection, tested the draft by holding a burning twist of grass near the firebox opening and watching the smoke pull inward rather than drift into the room. He worked quietly and precisely, and when he was finished, he stood at the entrance ramp and said what needed saying without decoration. "The floor is warm. It works." "I know it works," Erna said. "I'm telling you that it's good. You should hear someone say it." He walked away across the prairie. Erna watched him go. She thought about Dietrich, who had said things plainly and meant them completely. She thought about the 40 years of a marriage in which someone had looked at what she built and called it good. She went back inside and built a small fire, 3 pieces of wood, nothing more, and sat on the sleeping platform as the tiles warmed beneath her, as the stored heat of the day rose through river stone and earthen fill and gapped cottonwood boards and reached her without asking anything in return. The temperature outside that evening was 32 degrees. Inside the dugout, with no fire burning, the air held at 50. With a cooking fire warming the tile channel, the sleeping platform would reach 70 or 75 within an hour. She was warmer than any house in Elhorn. Not one person in that town knew it. Then Gerhardt came. She was splitting kindling behind the dugout, working through the rhythm of it, the lift, the angle, the controlled force of the maul, when she saw him crossing the prairie from the direction of town. She recognized the walk before the face. That particular deliberate stride, no wasted motion, arms at his sides. She set down the maul and waited. He stopped 10 feet from the entrance ramp, looked at the sod roof barely visible above grade, looked at the chimney pipe rising from the earth, looked at Flint, who had risen from the entrance, and was growling not the sharp bark he gave to strangers, but something quieter and more continuous, the sound of a dog that has taken a precise measurement of a person and doesn't like the result. "I hear you're squatting on unclaimed land," Gerhardt said. "It is unclaimed." I checked. A 62-year-old woman cannot file a legal claim. "I can occupy and improve. Territorial law allows it." His jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to having his conclusions interrupted by facts. "I have rights to unclaimed land within 5 miles of my property for grazing purposes. You're interfering with my livelihood. This land has been unclaimed for 9 years. You never wanted it before." "Don't tell me what I wanted." He turned and walked away. But he looked back once, and the expression on his face was not anger exactly. It was something more particular than anger. The specific resentment that certain men carry for people who have refused to fail in the way they were supposed to fail, who have taken the verdict and disagreed with it, who are still standing in fields they should have left months ago. Flint growled until Gerhardt disappeared over the ridge. That night, Erna sat alone in the dugout. The fire had died to embers. The tiles were still warm, the air holding at 50 degrees, and she listened to the silence and thought about everything Gerhardt could do. A man with land, with standing in the church with 6 children and a wheat farm and a neighbor's ear, he could make a case before officials that a 62-year-old widow woman living in a hole in the ground simply could not make. She thought about it for a long time, longer than she would ever admit. She thought about walking back to Louise's house in the dark, telling Gerhardt she would work without wages, cook and clean, and tend his 6 children in exchange for a room somewhere that was not underground. Anything. Just to have walls that other people recognized as walls, and a ceiling that other people recognized as shelter, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow would not be the day the ground gave way beneath her. She could feel the pull of it, the warmth of giving up. Surrender has its own particular comfort. Stop digging. Stop calculating. Stop pretending that a 62-year-old woman with $9 and a dead husband's sketches could build something that 200 people had already decided was impossible. She thought about this for a long time in the quiet warmth of the dugout. The candle guttered in a draft. Flint lifted his head from the sleeping platform and looked at her across the small, dark space, steady and patient, asking nothing, offering the simple fact of his presence. And she heard Dietrich's voice, not from memory exactly, from the walls, from the clay tiles cooling slowly beneath her feet, still holding heat from a fire that had died 2 hours ago, faithful and precise, and exactly as promised. "The earth never lies, Erna." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We're staying," she said. Flint put his head down and closed his eyes. In the morning, Tobias Krell arrived again this time, with information he had gathered from a man named Hendrickson at the land office, delivered the same way he delivered everything plainly without theater. "Brandt has no grazing claim," he said, adjusting the chimney cap to prevent wind from reversing the draft. "The land is unregistered open territory. As long as you are actively improving it, you hold squatters' rights under territorial law. He cannot force you off." "He'll try." "Let him." Tobias checked the tile joints for cracks, each one in sequence, the way a craftsman checks his work, not because he doubts it, but because care is its own form of respect. "You have a dugout, a heating system, winter turnips in the ground. That's improvement under the statute. That's legally defensible." Erna looked at him. He was 19 years old, and already he carried himself like someone who understood that the world rewards people who know the rules and prepare accordingly. "My father lost land in Sweden," Tobias said, "to a man who lied about boundary lines. I learned what my father should have known before it mattered." He finished checking the joints. He stood. He looked at the sleeping platform, at the tiles at the chimney. He looked at Erna. "It's good work," he said again. "Someone should keep telling you that." He left. The prairie was wet and flat and cold. The sky above it was the color of pewter. And somewhere beneath the frozen earth, heat was traveling through 14 feet of clay, patient and steady and faithful, exactly as a dead man had designed it to do, years before he knew his wife would need it. Erna Voss stood at the entrance of the place she had built and looked out at the land that was not yet hers by law, but was already hers by effort, by survival, by the particular claim that people make on the world when they refuse to leave it. She went back inside. She built a fire. She thought about the tin box sitting on the shelf above the sleeping platform, the paper inside it still drying, still holding whatever Dietrich had needed her to know. It would tell her its secrets when it was ready. She had learned patience from the same man who had taught her about heat. She could wait. The dugout was finished by the last week of September. 5 feet deep, 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 140 square feet of underground space carved out of Nebraska earth by the hands of one 62-year-old woman over the course of 4 weeks. The walls were lined with the sod blocks she had cut from the surface, stacked tight and plumb, insulating the interior the way a body insulates its own core. The roof was cottonwood poles laid across the width covered with prairie grass and a final layer of sod that from above made the structure nearly invisible, just a slight rise in the earth with a crooked chimney pipe and a ramp descending into the ground. Erna stood inside it on the morning it was finished and turned in a slow circle. It was not beautiful. It did not resemble any room she had lived in during the 40 years of her marriage. The ceiling was low enough that she could touch it with her palm. The light came from a single narrow opening at the top of the entrance ramp, and in the afternoon it moved across the earthen floor in a single pale stripe. The smell was damp soil and cottonwood, and the faint mineral sharpness of clay mortar curing in the walls. But it was hers. Every inch of it was the result of her own hands and her own reasoning, and the knowledge Dietrich had given her across 40 years of evenings when other men were reading seed catalogs and he was sketching heating systems in the margins of ledger paper. She built a fire on the morning of the 18th of October. 3 small pieces of wood, nothing more. She knelt beside the firebox and watched the smoke enter the clay channel at the opening, pulled inward by the draft she had calculated, beginning its 14-foot journey through buried tile toward the chimney on the opposite wall. She walked to the chimney. She held her palm near the exit opening. Hot exhaust moved against her skin. Not warm, hot. The smoke had traveled the full length of the channel, given up its heat to the clay along the way, and was still carrying enough thermal energy to feel against her hand at the far end. The draft was working exactly as Dietrich had described it. The system was whole. 2 hours later, she climbed onto the sleeping platform and pressed her palm flat against the cottonwood boards. She held it there. Warm. Not merely not cold, warm the way a stone holds warmth after an afternoon in the sun, radiating upward from the river rocks beneath the platform, conducted through 8 inches of compacted earth, through the stone layer, through the gapped boards. 80 degrees, perhaps more. Free heat. Heat from a fire she needed to cook her morning meal anyway. Heat that every household in Elkhorn threw into the sky every morning without thinking about where it went. She lay down on the warm boards and pressed her cheek against the wood and closed her eyes. For the first time in 7 weeks, she was warm, without burning fuel she could not afford. The simple arithmetic of it settled into her the way warmth settles into cold hands slowly and completely, until she could not tell where the warmth ended and the relief began. She whispered something that was not quite a prayer and not quite a conversation. It was the particular address that grief invents when it needs somewhere to send the things it cannot hold alone. Thank you, Dietrich. Flint jumped onto the platform beside her, turned 3 circles in the way dogs do when they are performing a ritual older than memory, and collapsed with a groan of such absolute satisfaction that Erna laughed again. The same surprised sound that had escaped her the first night she brought him home. He opened one eye at the sound, thumped his tail twice against the warm boards, and went to sleep. Outside, the Nebraska sky was moving toward November. The temperature at night was dropping below freezing. In Elkhorn, families were stacking wood and checking mortar around their stovepipes and debating whether the winter would be mild or severe. They were doing all the things that people do when they trust the structures they already know. Inside the dugout, 4 miles out of town, a woman and a dog were warm. The difference between what the people of Elkhorn understood about cold and what Erna understood about it was 14 feet of buried clay tile. It was a gap that would not close until the winter forced it open. November brought the inspector. Gerhard had filed his complaint with the county land office in October, as Erna had known he would. He was a methodical man and he believed in official channels when official channels served his purposes. The complaint alleged that an elderly widow woman was unlawfully occupying and potentially endangering herself on unclaimed territorial land, and that the situation represented a public welfare concern requiring formal evaluation. Inspector Hale arrived on horseback on the 10th of December. He was 43 years old, wore a county badge on his wool coat, and had the efficient manner of a man who had evaluated many marginal situations and resolved them without sentiment. He had seen the complaint. He had formed a preliminary conclusion before dismounting from his horse. He tied the horse to the stake Tobias had driven beside the entrance ramp. He looked at the mound of sod that was the dugout roof. He looked at the chimney pipe. He looked at the entrance ramp descending into the ground and shook his head once. The small, private gesture of a man who believes the outcome is already written. He descended the ramp. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior. He saw the earthen walls plumb and tight, the cottonwood roof beams solid and properly spaced, the sleeping platform with its gapped boards, the firebox in the northwest corner with clay tiles disappearing into the floor at a precise angle, the chimney shaft rising clean through the earth. The curtained cigarette had hung across the entrance, the candle on the stone shelf, the date on the sleeping platform watching him with brown eyes that held complete calm and no welcome. The air was warm. That was the first thing he noticed, and it was the thing he had not expected. Warmer than the land office where he worked. Warmer than his own parlor on most December mornings. He asked the necessary questions. Erna answered them the way she answered everything without decoration. She was 62 years old. She was living alone in an underground structure on unclaimed land. She had excavated 5 feet, installed 140 square feet of living space, built a functioning heating system, and planted winter turnips. Inspector Hale looked at the tiles. He asked about the system. She explained it the way Dietrich had explained it to her across 40 years of evenings, the way a teacher explains something that has been understood so completely it no longer requires effort to describe. The buried tiles carry exhaust heat from the firebox. Smoke enters the channel at roughly 300 degrees. It travels 14 feet through clay, transferring heat to the tiles and the surrounding earth and stones. By the time it exits the chimney, it has given up most of its thermal energy. That energy is stored in the earth and stone beneath the sleeping platform and radiated upward over 6 to 8 hours. Hale walked to the firebox. He looked at the tile opening. He walked to the chimney. He looked at the exit. He walked back to the sleeping platform and placed his hand flat on the boards. His eyebrows moved, just slightly, just enough. Erna saw it. The platform was warm, 72 degrees on a day when the outside temperature was 14. He stood with his hand on the warm boards for a moment longer than was necessary for the purposes of his evaluation. And when he took his hand away, he looked at it briefly before looking at her. He asked how long the heat lasted after the fire died. 6 to 8 hours, she told him. The river stones beneath the platform store thermal energy and release it gradually. He was quiet. He looked around the dugout again. This time he was not looking at what he had expected to find. He was looking at what was actually there. He asked about the baseline temperature without any fire. 50 degrees, she said. Earth insulation at 5 feet depth maintains that temperature regardless of surface conditions. It does not change between July and January. The earth at that depth has its own memory of warmth, and it keeps it. Hale wrote something in his notebook. He closed it. He looked at Erna with the expression of a man who has arrived at a situation he did not prepare for and is deciding how to account for it honestly. He would file his report, he said. The land office would make its determination. He could only report what he observed. He observed a habitable structure with functional heating, insulated walls, adequate ventilation, and evidence of agricultural improvement. He paused at the bottom of the ramp. He said it quietly, and he said it only once. This is the warmest building I have entered today. In 6 buildings. He climbed the ramp and mounted his horse and rode back toward town without looking back. Gerhard Brandt would receive the inspector's report within a week. It would not say what he had needed it to say. Before he left, Hale had said one more thing, and he said it to Erna alone in a low voice that carried the specific weight of official information being shared outside its official context. Dietrich Voss had filed a preliminary application for homestead rights to this quarter section in March of 1883, 2 months before he died. The application was incomplete, the final paperwork never submitted. But the record had not been destroyed. It was sitting in the county land office under a layer of subsequent filings, technically unresolved, technically still active. If Erna could demonstrate continuous improvement of the property through the year 1886, she could complete the application and claim legal title under the Homestead Act. The land would be hers by law. Gerhard had no legal standing. He never had. The complaint he had filed was built on nothing, and Hale had known it before he arrived. But he had come anyway because the complaint raised a genuine welfare question, and he was not the kind of man who ignored genuine welfare questions on technicalities. Erna stood in the entrance of the dugout after Hale's horse disappeared over the ridge and held the information the way you hold something fragile carefully with both hands, afraid to examine it too quickly in case it turns out to be less than it appears. Dietrich had filed the application in March. He died in April. He had begun the legal process of claiming this land 2 months before his death. He had surveyed it, sketched it, buried his plans in the earth, and started the paperwork. He had been building toward this place from multiple directions simultaneously, the way he built everything with the thorough patience of a man who understood that lasting structures require preparation at every level. He had not told her. Perhaps he meant it as a gift revealed when the paperwork was complete. Perhaps he simply ran out of time. Perhaps some things are completed by the people left behind. Erna went inside. She sat on the warm sleeping platform with Flint beside her and did not speak for a long time. The evening of December 12th was cold and clear. The temperature outside had dropped to 18 degrees by the time Erna built her cooking fire. She made her meal and ate it on the sleeping platform with the candle lit on its stone shelf and the curtains Sigrid had brought moving gently in the draft from the entrance ramp. The tiles beneath her were warming toward their peak temperature. Flint was asleep against her side. She reached for the tin box on the shelf above the platform. 3 months had passed since she had found it in the earth on the first day of digging. 3 months of drying, of slow stabilization of the damp, releasing its grip on old paper left too long in the ground. She had held it up to the light many times during those months, trying to read what the bleeding ink would reveal. Most of it had remained illegible, fragments only, the shape of letters without their meaning. But tonight the light was steady and the candle flame was calm, and she held the paper at the angle that the light best reached and began to read. The ink had not fully recovered. Some words were still lost, washed into the paper and gone. But enough had survived. Enough had come back through the slow patience of air and time to show her what Dietrich had written. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time with the paper on her lap and her hands open, and the warm floor beneath her, and the cold Nebraska night pressing against the earth above her head from every direction, and she understood. He had not simply designed a heating system. He had designed this specific heating system for this specific piece of ground, measured and calculated and adjusted for the exact soil composition beneath her feet, the exact distance to the creek, the exact orientation required to use the prevailing northwest wind for chimney draft. Every angle in the system she had built was the angle he had written down. Every dimension was his dimension. The 1-inch drop per foot in the tile channel, the northwest placement of the firebox, the 14-foot run, the river stone layer. She had not built something new. She had built something Dietrich had already designed from memory, using the knowledge he had given her across 40 years of evenings when she had not known she was being taught. He had buried these plans in the earth of this specific quarter section because he had stood on this ground and believed in it. He had surveyed the soil depth and the drainage and the water table and the wind patterns. He had calculated what could be built here and what it would take and what it would become. He had filed the homestead application. He had bought the tiles in his mind and calculated the watt and believed the money could be found. He had planned to come back here with her. He had planned to stand on this ground with Erna and say, I found us a quiet place, a warm place, a place where we don't have to depend on anyone for anything that the earth can give us freely. He had not come back, but he had sent her, without knowing it, without intending it. Through 40 years of patient instruction, he had given her everything she needed to follow the map he left in the ground. She had walked to this piece of earth because it was the only unclaimed land within walking distance of Elhorn, and it turned out that the man who had known her completely had already decided it was exactly where she should be. She was not building something new. She was finishing what he had started. The paper shook slightly in her hands. She pressed it against her chest and wept. Not from grief exactly, though grief was part of it. From the particular feeling that arrives when you understand that love does not end when the person who carried it stops breathing. It changes form. It becomes knowledge. It becomes the angle of a tile channel and the ratio of clay to sand and mortar and the placement of a firebox in a northwest corner. It becomes a warm floor in an underground room. It becomes the reason you are still alive. Flint pushed his nose against her hand. She put her palm on his head and felt the warmth of him, the solid skull beneath the fur. And she sat like that for a long time in the warm underground room that her husband had dreamed of, while the Nebraska night went dark above the earth and the stars came out cold and sharp over the flat prairie. She would tell no one what the letter said. It was not a secret she kept from shame or from strategy. It was simply too large to explain to people who had not known Dietrich, who had not spent 40 years learning to hear the world the way he heard it. Some things are not diminished by being kept. They are protected. She folded the paper carefully and put it back in the tin box and set the box in its place on the shelf above the sleeping platform. Sigrid came on the second Thursday of December and did not bring porridge. She brought news instead delivered from the entrance ramp because her knees would not allow the descent that day. Gerhard Brandt had received Inspector Hale's report. The report had not given him what he wanted. He had gone to Pastor Drummond. He had written another letter to the county. He had told anyone who would listen that an elderly woman living alone underground was a public hazard and a moral embarrassment to the community. The community had mostly listened and mostly agreed with the parts that were comfortable and mostly done nothing. Inspector Hale had filed his report as he said he would. The report noted a habitable structure, a functioning heating system, evidence of agricultural improvement, and a claimant exercising her territorial rights under applicable law. The report did not recommend removal. Gerhardt was not finished. He would not be finished. But for now, the official machinery had run in the direction of fact rather than in the direction of what he wanted, and that would have to hold. Sigrid studied Erna from the entrance ramp with the focused attention of a woman who has lived 7 decades and learned to read people the way farmers read weather. Make sure everything is sound, she said. Make sure the heating works without fault. When the hard cold comes, and it is coming, you need the system to be beyond question. She stood leaning on her cane and looked out across the flat, gray December prairie. It is coming soon, she said. I can feel it in the way the air sits. Not the normal December cold. Something larger. She left. Erna went back inside and checked every tile joint, every stone layer, every seal between the firebox and the channel opening. She checked the chimney draft with a twist of dried grass held near the firebox opening. The smoke pulled inward and down without hesitation. The system was sound. Louisa came on the afternoon of December 12th while Erna was splitting kindling. She crossed the prairie from the direction of town with that characteristic walk, the one that carried 40 years of bracing for the next difficulty, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She stopped 6 feet from the entrance ramp. She looked older than she had in August. The skin beneath her eyes was bruised with the particular exhaustion of a household that is held together by effort rather than ease. Her coat was the same one she had worn to her own wedding. She said Gerhardt needed help through the winter. The children were young and the hired man had quit in November. She said there was a back bedroom. She said regular meals. She said Erna would be part of the family again. The word family fell between them in the cold air and did not land well. Erna said she had a home. Louisa looked at the dugout entrance, at the chimney pipe, at the neat stack of split wood along the south wall of the structure, at all of it assembled as evidence she had not expected to find. She said surviving in a hole was not the same as living. Erna said the dugout maintained 50 degrees without any fire. She said the sleeping platform held 70 degrees after cooking. She said she was warmer than anyone in Louisa's house right now. Louisa's mouth tightened. She said Erna had made her point. She said everyone knew she could survive. She said come back before something happened that could not be undone. Erna looked at her, at the woman who had stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room on August 28th and not moved, who had heard the argument and lost it before it fully began, who had handed over $9 with shaking hands and said fine work in Elhorn, as though that were a thing a 62-year-old widow woman without references could simply do. She said Dietrich wanted her to be free. She said this is what free looks like. Louisa stood in the cold for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of something she would not put into words, and turned and walked back across the prairie toward town without looking back. Erna watched her until she was a small point against the gray horizon. Then she went inside and built a small fire and sat on the warm platform with Flint's head in her lap and did not cry. She had finished crying over people who chose the easier path, but the silence in the dugout afterward had a different weight to it than before. Heavier. The candle on the stone shelf seemed dimmer, though it was the same candle it had always been. The morning of December 13th, Flint would not go outside. Erna opened the entrance and the gate planted himself at the bottom of the ramp and would not move. She had never seen him refuse to go out. He was not a fearful dog. He had walked calmly toward a coyote at the creek bank in October. He had faced Gerhard Brandt with steady hackles and not retreated one step. He was afraid of nothing that walked on four legs or two, but this morning he pressed himself against the warm, sleeping platform and made a sound from deep in his chest, thin and continuous, and his eyes were focused on something that was not in the room. Erna climbed the ramp alone and stood on the prairie and looked at the sky. The color was wrong. Not the gray of normal December overcast, not the flat white that came before ordinary snowfall. It was yellowish, the exact color of a bruise on the third day stretched tight from northwest to southeast across the entire visible horizon. The air had a weight to it, a pressure that she felt in her ears the way she felt it before summer thunderstorms, except that this was December and there was no thunder in December. The birds were flying southeast, all of them. Not in the scattered patterns of winter foraging, but in deliberate, tight lines moving fast and low and without stopping, as though something behind them on the horizon was already visible to them and they had decided not to wait. She remembered what Sigrid had told her about the blizzard of 1873. The animals knew before the people. The cattle turned their backs to the northwest and refused to eat. The dogs went under the porches and would not come out for any calling. The old Norwegian families who had come from countries where winter was a serious thing read these signs and survived. The newer families, the ones who trusted thermometers and calendars over instinct, died in their houses with full wood piles because they waited too long to prepare. Erna went back inside. She checked her food, enough for 5 days if she was careful. She checked her wood, 2 weeks of fuel at normal burning. She checked the tile joints and the chimney draft and the entrance seal. She filled both water containers from the creek, 2 trips of 30 minutes each, knowing that if the storm came, the creek would be unreachable. Then she walked to town. The walk took 90 minutes. She went to the general store first where people gathered in the mornings. Mr. Whitfield was behind the counter. The same man who had marked Voss's Folly on his wall map with a cross like a grave marker. She said there was a storm coming. A serious one. She said the animals were reading the signs wrong, or rather reading them correctly, and that people should prepare. Extra wood inside, water stored, livestock in the barn. Whitfield looked at her over his spectacles. He turned to the 2 men standing near the stove and said the Voss woman was predicting blizzards now. He said first she was an engineer, now she was a weather prophet. The 2 men smiled. Erna left and went to the doctor's office. Dr. Merritt was a practical man from Ohio who believed in thermometers and evidence and very little else. She told him that the barometric pressure appeared to be dropping, that the animal behavior was consistent with a major pressure system approaching from the northwest. He said animals do not predict weather. He said barometric pressure was not something readable from a yellow sky. He said go home, it was December in Nebraska, and cold weather was not a catastrophe. She went to the church. Pastor Drummond was preparing his Sunday sermon. He listened with the patient expression of a man who believes he is being kind by not interrupting. He said only God knows the weather. He said if a storm was coming, they would trust in mercy. He said he suggested prayer rather than panic. She said she was not panicking, she was warning. She said there was a difference. She tried 3 more houses. The Hendersons told her to go home. The Markhams said they had survived 20 Nebraska winters without advice from a woman who lived in a hole. At the last house, 2 of the young men who had been among those placing wagers on the date of her death were sitting on the porch. One of them called out to the other when he saw her coming. He said something about the mole woman being out of her burrow and scared of sunshine. Erna said there was a storm coming and they should prepare. The young man said the only storm around was her going door to door telling people the sky was falling. He laughed. His friend laughed. She walked away. She stopped at one more house. Aldous Finch was 78 years old and had been on the Nebraska frontier since before the territory was a state. He was sitting on his porch in a rocking chair with a wool blanket across his knees despite the cold, which was itself a kind of statement. His eyes were the pale blue of water that has been frozen so long it has forgotten being liquid. His hands gripped the rocker arms with knuckles swollen by 50 years of hard work. Erna stood on the bottom step of his porch and said she believed a severe blizzard was approaching possibly that night, and that he should consider coming to town or coming to her dugout, which was warm and protected and underground where the wind could not reach it. Aldous looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he had survived 50 Nebraska winters. He said he had survived the grasshopper plague of 1874 and the drought of 1864 and the blizzard of 1873 when men half his age froze solid in their barns. He said he had buried 2 wives and 3 horses and was still sitting on this porch. He said he would survive whatever December sent. Erna said this storm might be different. He said every storm was different and he was still here. She stood on his porch step and thought about arguing. About describing the color of the sky, the angle of the birds, the behavior of the dog, the pressure in her ears. About telling him that the blizzard of 1873 had killed people exactly like him, people whose certainty was the last warm thing they felt. But Aldous Finch was not a man who could be persuaded by Erna Voss. He had made his survival into the central fact of his identity, and he would rather maintain the identity than accept help from someone he considered beneath his consideration. Some certainties cannot be argued with. They can only be survived or not. She said if he changed his mind, her dugout was 4 miles southwest near the rock outcrop. She said he was welcome any time. He said nothing. She left. The walk back to the dugout took 2 hours. The wind had shifted. It was coming from the northwest now, steady and cold, and carrying something inside it that was not quite snow, but was the intention of snow, the promise of what was gathering over the horizon. She could feel it against the left side of her face working at the seams of her coat testing. She descended the ramp and sealed the entrance behind her as well as she could. She built the largest fire she had built since completing the system, 6 pieces of wood instead of her usual 4. She watched the smoke pull down into the tile channel, watched it disappear into the clay, and she counted the minutes until she could feel the heat beginning to move through the stones beneath the sleeping platform. Then she sat with her back against the earthen wall and Flint beside her, and she waited. She was not afraid. That surprised her somewhat, the absence of fear. She had been afraid many times in the past 4 months in ways she had not let herself name at the time. The fear of starvation in the first week, the fear of the cold before the dugout was finished, the fear of what Gerhardt might do, the fear of the long winter ahead with its mathematics of fuel and food and endurance. She had carried those fears quietly and not examined them too closely. But tonight, sitting in her underground room with the warm floor beneath her and the sealed entrance above, and 4 months of careful preparation surrounding her on every side, she felt something she had not expected. She felt ready, not certain, not safe in any way that could be guaranteed. The storm that was coming would be what it was, and she could not know yet how serious that would be. But she had built the right thing in the right way, in the right place, and she had built it entirely on her own, and she had checked it and rechecked it, and she knew every joint and every stone and every inch of its 14-foot journey through the earth beneath her feet. Dietrich had given her this knowledge across 40 years of ordinary evenings, and she had carried it faithfully without knowing she was carrying it, and now it was the only thing standing between her and whatever the prairie was about to send. It was enough. It was exactly enough. She thought about the tin box on the shelf, about the letter inside it now folded carefully. The ink stabilized the words clear. About Dietrich standing on this piece of ground sometime in the winter or spring of 1883, pacing out the dimensions, measuring the soil depth, calculating the angles, and then kneeling in the cold Nebraska earth to bury his plans in a tin box for safekeeping. He had believed in this place before she had ever seen it. He had believed in her ability to find it and understand it and build what he had drawn, even if neither of them could have told you then exactly how that would happen. She said something then to the warm air of the dugout, to the earthen walls that held Dietrich's knowledge in their clay, to the tiles beneath her feet that were doing exactly what he had calculated they would do. She said, "I finished it. I finished what you started." Flint shifted beside her and put his chin on her knee and closed his eyes. Outside, the first snow began to fall. She could not see it from underground, but she could hear the particular silence that settles over the prairie when snow begins, the way the wind changes its voice, and she knew. She added one more piece of wood to the firebox. She watched the smoke enter the channel. She listened to the draft, that faint whisper of air moving through clay that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing, and she waited for the storm to show her what it was made of. The storm did not build, it arrived. One moment the wind was steady and cold and manageable, the kind of wind that Nebraska produced on ordinary December nights. The next moment, it was something else entirely, something that had no gradation between what it had been and what it became, like a door thrown open onto a room that should not exist. Erna heard it from 5 feet underground. She heard it the way you hear an explosion from the bottom of a well, a low, concussive roar that built in the first seconds and then did not stop building. That grew until it became a continuous living thing, pressing against the earth above her head from every direction simultaneously. The cottonwood roof beams vibrated. Fine particles of soil sifted down from between the sod layers in the ceiling. Flint was on his feet before the sound fully arrived, standing on the sleeping platform, with every muscle rigid, ears forward, facing upward, as though he could see through 5 feet of Nebraska earth to whatever was producing that sound. The temperature outside dropped from 12 degrees to -10 in the first hour. By midnight, it was -25. The wind held at 70 miles per hour without dropping, without pausing, without any of the natural rhythms that ordinary storms possess. It was sustained and total and indifferent, the way serious cold is always indifferent, without malice, without purpose, simply a condition of the world that had arrived and intended to remain. Inside the dugout, Erna built her evening fire. 4 pieces of wood, the same as most nights. She watched the smoke enter the tile channel and disappear into the clay. She listened to the draft working cleanly through the system, that faint whisper of air moving through buried pipes that she had come to know as well as her own pulse. The tiles heated, the river stones absorbed, the sleeping platform warmed. She ate her evening meal sitting on the warm boards with Flint beside her, spooning beans from the pot she had cooked over the same fire that was currently heating the floor beneath her. The temperature in the dugout held at 52 degrees without any additional effort. With her body heat and Flint's and the residual warmth radiating upward from the tiles, the air in the room felt warmer than that. 5 feet above her head, the worst blizzard Nebraska had seen in a decade was converting the open prairie into something that could kill a person in minutes. She thought about the houses in Elkhorn. She thought about their wooden walls and their single-pane windows and their stoves that fought the cold rather than avoiding it, that threw their exhaust heat into the sky every morning and every evening and asked the fire to keep working harder to replace what had been thrown away. She thought about how a house like that behaves when the temperature outside reaches -25 and the wind finds every gap in the construction, every place where the caulking has dried and cracked, every space around the window frames where the cold can force itself through at 70 miles per hour and create drafts that no stove in Elkhorn was built to overcome. She thought about Aldous Finch in his rocking chair. She thought about him once, and then she set the thought aside because there was nothing to be done about it now, and because the mathematics of her own situation required her full attention. 2 weeks of wood for one person. If others came and she believed they would come, the calculation changed completely. She began doing the arithmetic in her head the way Dietrich had taught her to approach every problem, starting with what was known and working outward from there. The storm hit the Brandt household at full force within the first 2 hours. The house was well built by Elkhorn standards. Gerhard Brandt was not a careless man, and the structures he maintained reflected the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. But well built by Elkhorn standards meant wooden walls, standard construction, a stove in the main room, and a secondary stove in the kitchen, and the assumption that a fire burning continuously would be sufficient against whatever Nebraska winter produced. That assumption had been tested against ordinary Nebraska winters and had held. This was not an ordinary Nebraska winter. The wind found the gaps at the window frames within the first hour. It found the place where the front door frame had settled slightly off, creating a space no wider than a finger that the cold could use as an entry point. It found the space beneath the kitchen door and the gap where the stovepipe met the ceiling, and every other place where the construction of a wooden house necessarily falls short of being a sealed environment. And cold air forced through gaps at 70 miles per hour does not behave the way cold air behaves on ordinary days. It creates pressure differentials that draw more cold air in through other gaps. It defeats the radiant zone around a stove by moving the cold air faster than the stove can warm it. It turns a house that would be adequate in a normal December into something that cannot protect the people inside it from the temperature that is pressing against every surface from outside. Gerhardt burned wood at a rate he had never burned it before. He fed the stoves every 30 minutes, alternating between the two, keeping both fires as large as the fireboxes would safely hold. By midnight, the house interior was 42 degrees despite burning fuel that was supposed to last the entire winter at half this rate. His 6 children were layered in every piece of clothing they owned. Blankets were stacked and redistributed. The family pressed together in the main room near the larger stove. The children's breath was visible in the air inside their own home. The youngest was Mina. She was 5 years old and small for her age, 38 pounds, not enough body mass to maintain adequate core temperature when the environment surrounding her falls to 42 degrees and keeps falling. By the second hour of the storm, she had stopped moving with the restlessness that characterizes healthy children. She was quiet in a way that Louisa recognized from stories about the blizzard of 1873. Stories that had not ended well. By dawn of December 15th, the house interior was 38 degrees. They had burned half their winter wood in 14 hours. Gerhardt stood at the window and looked at what was outside it, which was nothing, a complete white absence, where the barn had been 40 feet away, where the fence line had been, where the world had been 12 hours ago. The storm had replaced the world with itself with this continuous howling, white nothing that moved at 70 miles per hour and had no visible end and no discernible direction. Just an omnidirectional assault on everything that was not underground. He thought about the dugout. He had been thinking about it for the last 2 hours without letting himself complete the thought. He thought about what he knew of it, which was mostly what he had seen when he went out to threaten Erna, about the land claim, the sod mound barely visible above grade, the chimney pipe, the entrance ramp going down. He thought about Inspector Hale's report, which he had read 3 times trying to find the language that would support his complaint, and had instead found the phrase functioning heating system and the phrase warmest building entered that day. He thought about Mina, who had not spoken in an hour and whose skin had taken on a color that he did not want to look at directly. He thought about what a man who is wrong about something does when being wrong about it is going to kill his children. On the morning of December 16th, Gerhardt Brandt made the decision. They would walk to the dugout, 2 miles through the blizzard. It was possible they would not survive the walk. It was certain they would not survive another night in the house. The walk offered a chance. The mathematics of staying offered nothing. He bundled Minna in everything they had. Louisa held the hands of the 2 middle children so tightly that her knuckles went white inside her mittens. The 3 older children held on to Gerhardt and each other and promised not to let go, the kind of promise children make when they understand with sudden completeness what it would mean to break it. They opened the front door and the storm came in. The walk was 2 miles. It took 90 minutes. Every step was a negotiation with wind that wanted to push them down and snow that moved horizontally and cold that worked at every exposed inch of skin with the patient efficiency of something that does not tire. Gerhardt lost feeling in his face within 10 minutes, white patches on both cheeks and across the bridge of his nose that he could not feel and therefore could not assess. Louisa gripped the children's hands by memory because her fingers had gone beyond numbness to a place that did not have a sensation to report. Minna was silent in Gerhardt's arms. That was the worst part of the walk. She had stopped responding 20 minutes in. Her eyes were closed. Her body was weight without resistance, the particular limpness of a child who has gone somewhere inside herself, that the cold and the noise and the terror have driven her to somewhere she may not be able to find her way back from without help. Gerhardt kept walking. He could not stop to check on her because stopping meant dying. He kept walking and he held her, and he did not think about what her stillness meant. They found the dugout by memory and by the rock outcrop that Erna had mentioned when she said he was welcome anytime. One of the older boys found the entrance ramp half buried in drifted snow. They dug with their hands, fingers that could no longer feel the snow they were moving, and uncovered the door and pounded on it with fists that had no sensation left to report from the impact. Erna opened the door. Warm air came out of the dugout and met the -25 air outside and became visible, became a bloom of vapor in the space between inside and outside, like breath made suddenly visible, like the dugout itself exhaling. Gerhardt looked at her. She looked at him. The last time they had stood this close, he had placed $9 on a table between them and told her that her husband had died in debt and left her nothing. Now he was standing in the entrance of the structure she had built with those $9, and the knowledge that dead man had given her holding his youngest grandchild, who might already be too cold to save with nowhere else on the surface of the earth to go. Erna stepped aside. She did not say anything. Not one word of what she had earned the right to say. She stepped aside and let them come. 8 people stumbled down the ramp and onto the floor of her 140 square feet, snow-covered and frost-covered, and shaking with the deep involuntary trembling that the body produces when it has been using its last reserves to maintain a core temperature that it can no longer maintain. The children made sounds that were not quite crying sounds that came from a place below the ordinary register of distress. Gerhardt laid Minna on the sleeping platform without being told to. The child was unconscious. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her skin was the grayish color that Louisa had recognized from those stories. Erna built the fire larger than she had ever built it. 6 pieces of wood, then a 7th. She needed maximum heat through the tile system immediately, not gradually. She watched the smoke pull into the channel and disappear into the clay, and she counted minutes. Within 30 minutes, the tiles had reached peak temperature. Within an hour, the sleeping platform was at 85 degrees, the warmest it had ever been. Heat radiating upward through the stone layer in the earthen fill in the gapped cottonwood boards and reaching the unconscious child who was lying directly above the central tiles. Erna wrapped Mina in her own blanket and positioned the small body precisely over the place where the tiles ran hottest. Then she waited and she tended the fire and she watched. Color began returning to the child's face after 40 minutes. Slowly, the way fog lifts from a valley, which is not all at once but in patches and places until you realize the fog is gone and you cannot say exactly when it left. Mina's breathing deepened. The grayness receded. The blue left her lips. She opened her eyes and looked around the dim underground space with the unfocused attention of someone returning from a great distance. She looked at the earthen walls and the low ceiling and the candle on the stone shelf and the dog lying on the platform beside her. "It is warm," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was there. It was present. It was the voice of a child who was coming back. "Yes," Erna said. "It is warm. Go back to sleep." Minna closed her eyes, then more pounding on the door. Mrs. Prentice and her husband, their 4-year-old son Emmett, in her husband's arms. Their roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow drifting against the windward side. Emmett had been in the room when the ceiling came down. He was physically uninjured, but his eyes were open and focused on nothing, staring at a point somewhere beyond whatever room he was in, as though the sound of splitting timber and collapsing snow had sent him somewhere inside himself that he had not come back from. Mrs. Prentice stood at the top of the ramp looking down at Erna. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. She looked at Erna with an expression that existed below the level where shame and embarrassment operate, in a place where a person understands in a single moment that the story they have been telling about someone else was wrong in every direction, wrong in its details, and wrong in its conclusions, and wrong in the confidence with which it was repeated to anyone who would listen. Erna opened the door wider. Pastor Drummond came next, his wife and 2 daughters behind him, the church windows having shattered inward on the north side when the wind found the weakness in the old glazing putty and made use of it. The pastor who had told Erna that only God knew the weather stood at the top of her entrance ramp in the middle of the worst storm of the decade and asked a 62-year-old woman who lived underground to save his family. Erna opened the door. The 2 young men who had laughed about the mole woman in her burrow came last alone. No family to shelter, just 2 18- and 19-year-olds who had believed their youth was a kind of protection and had discovered in the last 12 hours that it was not. One of them had frozen tears on his cheeks in white lines. The other could not form words. He stood in the entrance and shook. Erna opened the door. 17 people in 140 square feet. She organized them the way she organized everything, which was to say, she started with the most important problem first and worked outward from there. The children went on the sleeping platform. 6 of them laid sideways, head to foot pressed together in the way that bodies pressed together generate more warmth than the sum of their individual outputs. Mina in the center above the hottest tiles, the oldest children on the edges, all of them wrapped in everything available. Adults against the walls. Gerhard and Louisa on the north side close enough to touch their children. Mrs. Prentice and her husband on the south, Emmett, between them silent and absent behind his open eyes. Pastor Drummond near the entrance with his wife and daughters, having insisted on the coldest position in the room, as though discomfort were a currency he was paying back. The two young men in the remaining corner, occupying as little space as two grown bodies could manage. Erna did not say a word of what she had earned the right to say. She turned to the firebox and began building the fire that would keep 17 people alive through the night. The fire larger now, 7 pieces of wood, 8. She needed maximum sustained heat through the tile system with 17 bodies to warm and a storm outside that was not going to end at a convenient hour. The smoke entered the channel and she listened to the draft, that familiar whisper of air moving through clay, and it was working. The system did not know there were 17 people instead of 1. The physics did not count heads. The tiles reached 200 degrees. The stones absorbed. The platform temperature climbed. The dugout air rose from 50 degrees to 55 as 17 bodies added their heat to the system. It was enough. It was enough to stop the shivering, enough to keep blood moving to extremities, enough to hold the line against the cold that was pressing against the earth above them from every direction. Gerhardt sat against the north wall with his back straight and his frostbitten hands open on his knees and looked at the floor beneath him. He pressed his palm flat against the earthen floor and held it there and felt the heat radiating upward through the soil from the buried tiles beneath. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly how this was possible. He said his house with a stove burning continuously had not held above 40 degrees. He said this dugout with a cooking fire was 55 and rising. He asked how. Erna was adjusting the fire. She did not look up. She said the buried tiles carry exhaust from the firebox. Smoke enters at roughly 300 degrees. It travels 14 feet through clay, transferring heat to the tiles and the stone and the earth around them. By the time it exits the chimney, it has given up most of its energy. That energy is stored in the stone beneath the sleeping platform and radiated upward for 6 to 8 hours. She said his stove exhaust goes directly up the chimney and outside. She said hers travels 14 feet through clay first. She said during that journey, it transfers heat that his system throws away every time a fire burns. She said she was heating this space with waste energy, heat that every household in Elkhorn paid for in wood and then discarded into the sky. Gerhardt looked at the tiles visible at the firebox opening. He looked at the chimney exit in the opposite corner. He looked at his children on the warm sleeping platform there, shivering, subsiding, their breathing deepening towards sleep. He looked at Minna, color in her face now, chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of a child who has come back from wherever the cold had taken her. He did not say anything else for a long time. Around midnight, Emmett spoke. Mrs. Prentice had been trying for hours, singing to him, talking to him, holding him. Nothing had crossed whatever distance the noise of the collapsing roof had created between him and the room he was in. He was 4 years old and he had gone somewhere that no adult voice could reach. Flint reached him. The dog had been lying near the sleeping platform since the refugees arrived, calm and watchful, moving only when someone stepped too close. He had not growled at anyone. Some instinct told him these people were not threats. They were wounded. Around midnight, he stood up and walked across the crowded floor to where Mrs. Prentice sat against the south wall with Emmett rigid in her lap. Flint pushed his nose gently against the boy's hand. Emmett did not respond. Flint pushed again, then laid his head on the child's lap, heavy and warm and patient. He breathed, and the boy felt the weight of the dog's head and the rise and fall of the dog's ribs beneath his hand. Something shifted behind Emmett's eyes. His hand moved slowly, the way a hand moves when it is remembering how fingers work. He placed his palm on Flint's head. The fur was warm. The skull beneath it was solid and real. Something alive and present and gentle, in a world that had spent the last 12 hours trying to tear itself apart. The boy whispered. He said, "Can I keep petting the dog?" Mrs. Prentice made a sound that was not a word, something older than language. Her arms tightened around her son, and she pressed her face into his hair, and her shoulders shook. In the dim underground space, every adult who was awake heard it. Something broke open in the room, some tension that had been held collectively since the first knock on the door, and the air in the dugout felt different after, as though the presence of one small voice asking a simple question had changed the pressure of everything. "Yes," Ernest said, "you can pet him as long as you want. His name is Flint," Flint the boy said. He moved his fingers through the fur, and Flint sighed that deep, bottomless and the boy's hand kept moving, and slowly the rigidity left his shoulders and his eyes focused on the dog's face and stayed there. He was coming back, one stroke at a time. Near dawn of the second day, Tobias Krell knocked on the door. He had spent the first night of the storm in the forge, the brick walls and the residual heat from the coals keeping him alive through the worst of it. In the morning, he had thought about Erna, alone in the dugout, and about Sigrid Halv, alone in her sod house 3 miles from town, sick, and without anyone to check on her, and he had put on everything he owned and gone out into it. He went to Sigrid first. The walk was 1 mile, and it nearly finished him. He followed the fence line with his bare hand against the wire post by post, the cold cutting through his gloves until the wall of the sod house appeared out of the white like something dreamed. Sigrid was inside wrapped in blankets beside a fire that had gone out hours before she heard him knock. The cold had moved through the walls of the sod house steadily, patiently the way water moves through stone, and she was conscious but barely too cold to stand, too weak to speak above a whisper. Her fingers would not uncurl from the blanket she was gripping. Tobias wrapped her in everything he could find in the sod house. He lifted her onto his back. He carried her out into the blizzard. 1 mile back to the fence line. 3 miles south to the rock outcrop. 4 miles total with a 71-year-old woman on the back of a 19-year-old blacksmith moving through a storm that had already killed people in Elhorn who would not be found until the snow melted in spring. He followed landmarks he had memorized on clear days and trusted his legs when landmarks failed him and did not stop. He knocked on the dugout door with a fist so numb he could not feel the wood. Erna opened the door. The warm air bloomed out into the white cold. There was Tobias Sigrid on his back, both of them sheathed in ice, both of them alive. 19 people now. Erna helped lower Sigrid onto the sleeping platform beside the Brandt children. The old woman was cold in the specific way that people are cold when they have been cold for many hours, cold that has settled into the deep tissues, cold that the body has accepted as its new condition. But her eyes were clear. That was what Erna looked at first. The eyes. They were clear. Tobias collapsed at the bottom of the ramp. Erna gave him water, and he sat with his back against the earthen wall and let the warmth of the room begin its work on him, methodical and patient, the way all warmth works when you give it time. Sigrid looked around the packed dugout from the sleeping platform. She looked at the children sleeping around her, at the adults against the walls, at Flint with his head on Emmett's lap, at Erna standing at the firebox adding wood with the focused attention of someone who understands that each decision about fuel is a decision about how long the warmth can last. She said it quietly and clearly in the voice she always used when she meant something completely. She said Erna had finished what Dietrich started. Erna did not answer. She placed another piece of wood in the firebox and watched the smoke enter the tiles. The same 14 feet, the same physics, the same patient transfer of heat from waste into warmth, from what would have been thrown away into what was keeping 19 people alive through the night. Tobias sat beside her after everyone was asleep. The fire settled into its steady rhythm. The storm continued above them, that muffled, continuous roar that the sleeping bodies had absorbed into their dreams. His hand found hers in the dark, and she did not pull away. They sat shoulder to shoulder against the earthen wall, not speaking, listening to 19 people breathe in the warm underground room, while the worst blizzard in a decade spent itself against 5 feet of Nebraska earth and accomplished nothing. Erna leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes for a few minutes. Not sleep. Something adjacent to sleep, a brief suspension of vigilance just long enough to feel what it was to not carry everything alone. On the morning of the third day, the storm weakened. The roar above them softened from a scream to a moan. The pressure in Erna's ears eased. Flint, who had not approached the entrance ramp since the storm began, walked halfway up it and stood there with his ears forward, listening to something that was not the continuous assault it had been. Minna's fever, which had spiked during the second night, as her body processed the damage the cold had done, broke before dawn. Louisa felt the child's forehead, and the heat was gone. The sweat was drying. The small face was peaceful. Louisa said it quietly. She said the fever broke. She said Minna was through it. The words moved through the crowded dugout like something physical. People who had been holding breath for 3 days exhaled. Someone laughed. Someone else began to cry. The sounds mixed together in the warm underground air and became something that was neither laughter nor grief, but both at once the sound of people who have been on the edge of the worst thing and have come back from it, who have arrived on the other side and are only now beginning to understand where they have been. On the morning of December 17th, the storm ended. It did not fade gradually, it stopped. One moment the roar was there vibrating through the earth. The next moment, it was gone. The silence that replaced it was so complete that several people woke, believing something had gone wrong, that the absence of sound was itself a danger. Nothing had gone wrong. Something had finally gone right. Erna climbed the entrance ramp and dug through 3 feet of packed snow with her hands. Flint scrambled up behind her, clawing at the snow with urgency, desperate for the open air he had refused for 3 days. She broke through into morning light so bright it was physically painful, the kind of white that the world produces after a major storm when the sun comes out over unbroken snow and the light has nothing to absorb it. She stood at the top of the ramp and looked toward Elhorn. She could not see it. 4 miles away and invisible, buried. The prairie that had been brown winter grass stretching to the horizon was now an unbroken field of white, so vast and so flat and so complete that it looked as though the earth had been remade in a single color overnight. One by one the others climbed out, blinking and squinting and holding their hands up against the light. They stood in a ragged line on the snow-covered prairie and looked at what the storm had done to their world, and none of them spoke for a long time. Gerhardt was the first to move. He started walking toward town, breaking trail, through snow that reached his waist in places. Louisa followed with the children, Mrs. Prentice and her husband, Pastor Drummond and his family. The two young men, they walked in single file through the white world, following the trail Gerhardt broke, and they did not look back. The damage in Elhorn was severe. 3 houses had lost their roofs entirely. 7 more had structural damage. The church had lost every window on the north side. The general store porch had been torn from the building and deposited in pieces across Main Street. Livestock had died in barns that failed. 3 people had died. Margaret Weiss, 72, found in her bed on December 18th. Her house had held, but her stove had gone out during the second night, and she had not had the strength to relight it. She had covered herself with every blanket she owned and gone to sleep. The cold had taken her quietly. A bachelor farmer named Silas Kern, 44, found in his barn. He had gone out during the first night to check on his horses. The wind had turned him around. He made it to the barn but could not find his way back to the house. 30 yards. He died at 30 yards from his own front door, circling, walking in loops, blind in the white, 15 feet from safety. And Aldous Finch. The search party reached his house on the afternoon of December 18th, digging through the drift that had buried the structure to its roofline. He was in his rocking chair, blanket on his knees, eyes closed. The stove was cold. The woodpile beside it was full. He had not run out of fuel. His woodpile was full. At some point during the second night, he had stopped feeding the fire. Whether from exhaustion or confusion, or the particular surrender that arrives when a man who has survived everything finally encounters the thing that is larger than his certainty, no one could know. He had simply stopped, and the cold that had been waiting patiently on the other side of the walls had moved in. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was calm. He looked like a man who had sat down in his chair and closed his eyes to rest. Erna heard the news from Tobias, who had gone into town to help with the recovery efforts. She was sitting on the entrance ramp of the dugout with Flint beside her when he told her, and she sat very still for a moment and looked out at the snow-covered prairie and thought about pale blue eyes and a voice saying, "I have survived 50 Nebraska winters in the woodpile that had been full." Then she cried, not for long, not the sustained grief of losing someone close. A shorter and more specific grief for a man she had barely known, who died because he would not accept help from someone he had decided was beneath his consideration. Grief for the waste of it, a full woodpile, a cold stove, a man too proud to walk 4 miles to a warm floor. Sigrid, who was sitting in the entrance, wrapped in a borrowed blanket in the thin winter sun, put her hand on Erna's shoulder and said she had done what could be done. She said Erna had gone to his house. She had told him. She had left the invitation open. She said, carry the sadness if it needed carrying, but do not carry the blame. She said the blame did not belong to Erna, and taking it would only weigh down things that needed to move freely. Erna wiped her eyes. Flint put his head on her knee. The apologies came over the following days, each one in its own form, shaped by the particular character of the person delivering it. Pastor Drummond stood before his congregation on the first Sunday after the storm and said it plainly. He said he had told Erna Voss that only God knew the weather. He said he had used those words to avoid acknowledging that a woman he had dismissed understood something he did not. He said that was not faith. He said that was pride wearing the clothing of faith, which was the most dangerous kind of pride because it felt like virtue while it operated. He said he owed Erna Voss an apology delivered in the same public forum where his failure had occurred. The congregation was quiet. Some people nodded. Some looked at their hands. One of the young men, the 19-year-old who had made the joke about the mole woman scared of sunshine, found Erna at the general store 3 days after the storm. He stood in front of her with his hat in both hands and his eyes moving between her face and the floor. He said he had called her names. He said he had bet money on the date of her death and called it entertainment. He said he had made a joke out of a life that someone was fighting to keep. He looked up. He said she was the bravest person he had ever encountered in his life, and he was ashamed of what he had done, and he was sorry. Erna looked at him for a moment. He was 19 years old, barely past the age where a person understands the full weight of what they say and do, young enough that his shame was still new and still had the power to change him if he let it. She said, "Do not bet on people's lives anymore." She said that was enough. He nodded and walked away quickly, and she did not watch him go. Inspector Hale returned on the 22nd of December. He came without official announcement, tying his horse at the stake beside the entrance ramp and descending without preamble. He was carrying a document. It was a certificate of land improvement, formally recognizing Erna's claim to the quarter section under territorial squatters' rights and noting the homestead application filed by Dietrich Voss in March of 1883, now transferred to his widow under applicable law. The document had been prepared at the county office with the kind of speed that official documents rarely achieve, which suggested that someone with authority had decided the paperwork should move. Hale said it simply. He said this was her land. He said no one could take it from her. He shook her hand. His grip was firm and formal in the way that official transactions require formality. Then he paused before releasing her hand and said quietly, 19 people. He said he had put that in his report as well. He climbed the ramp and rode back toward Elhorn. Erna descended into the dugout alone. She sat on the sleeping platform in the dim quiet of the room she had built, Flint beside her, the curtains Sigrid had hung moving gently in the draft from the entrance, the candle casting its small, steady light on the earthen walls. She took the tin box from the shelf above the platform. She took out the letter inside it, unfolded it carefully, held it near the candle. She looked at Dietrich's handwriting, at the angles and dimensions and calculations he had made for this exact piece of ground, at the floor plan of this exact room at the tile channel, sketched with the precise economy of a man who thought in solutions. He had not left her nothing. He had left her the map. He had left her the knowledge. He had left her the legal foundation for the claim. He had left her in the ground itself the plans for the room she was sitting in, on the land that was now formally and legally hers. He had left her everything that mattered and nothing that could be taken. She sat for a long time with the paper on her lap and her hands open and the warmth rising steadily through the stones and the boards beneath her, faithful and precise, exactly as he had calculated it would be. For the first time since April, since the Tuesday in spring when a strong man's heart had stopped in a south field without warning, Erna Voss felt something settle into place that had been displaced for a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. The feeling of a person who has been tested against a standard they did not set and has met it completely. She smiled. It was a small smile, private, not intended for anyone to see. Flint saw it anyway. He thumped his tail against the warm boards. Gerhardt came on Christmas Eve. He crossed the snow-covered prairie alone in the late afternoon. No children, no Louisa, just the man himself in his heavy coat moving slowly through the drifts with the deliberate stride she had recognized from 4 months ago when it had been the stride of someone arriving to take something. She waited at the top of the ramp. He stopped 10 feet away, the same distance he had maintained every time, and looked at the sod roof and the chimney pipe and the entrance ramp and the chase standing at the edge of the ramp watching him without growling, which was its own kind of judgment. He said the heating system worked. He said he wanted to install the tile system in his house under the sleeping area using the stove exhaust. He said he could pay for the materials. Erna said she would show him how. He nodded, he looked at the ground, he looked at the sky, he looked at everything except her face for a long moment. He said he had been wrong about the dugout. Erna waited. She waited for the rest of it, for the sentence to continue into the territory where the real apology lived, where a man looks at what he has done to a person and names it plainly and takes the weight of it on himself without asking the person he wronged to help him carry it. The sentence did not continue. Gerhard Brandt was a man who could admit error about engineering because engineering existed in the world of facts, and facts could be acknowledged without cost. But admitting what he had done to Erna, setting a 62-year-old woman out in August with $9 and a blanket and a sentence designed to remove her dignity, along with her shelter that lived in a different territory. That required a kind of courage that was not available to every person who needed it. He had been wrong about the dugout. Erna looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come by in the spring when the ground softens." She said she would walk him through the tile placement, in the chimney angles, and the mortar ratios. She said the system would cut his fuel cost by more than half. He nodded. He turned and walked back across the snow. He did not look back. She watched him until he was gone from sight, and then she went inside. By February of 1884, 6 families in Elkhorn had asked Erna to consult on their heating systems. She walked each family through the principles, the way Dietrich had walked her through them, across 40 years of evenings with the patience of someone for whom the knowledge is no longer separate from the life it came from. She explained the tile placement and the chimney draft and the angle of descent and the ratio of clay to sand in the mortar and the importance of river stones for thermal mass. She charged nothing. She told Tobias when he asked her why that knowledge which saves lives is not something you sell. It is something you give away as fast as you can. Tobias helped with the installations. He forged brackets and grates and chimney caps at the smithy and brought them to each house without billing for his labor. And when Erna asked him the same question, he said, "Because you did not charge for yours." In 1886, Erna filed the Homestead Act claim formally, and the land became hers by law as well as by effort. Tobias organized the community to help her build a frame house above ground that year with glass windows and wood floors and a tile heating system running from the kitchen stove through channels beneath the bedroom and the parlor. The same principle, the same physics, the same gift from Dietrich built now into a house that stood above the earth where the neighbors could see it. She kept the dugout. She maintained it carefully, clearing the entrance and checking the tile joints each autumn, keeping it as a root cellar and emergency shelter. Privately, she maintained it as the place where everything had begun. The place she had built with $9 and a dead man's knowledge, while 200 people bet against her survival. Sigrid Halv died in the winter of 1891 at the age of 79. She died in the bedroom of Erna's house, in the bed above the heated floor, warm and comfortable, with people who loved her in the room. Her last words were to Erna. She said Dietrich had been right about the earth. She said she had been right about Erna. Flint died in the spring of 1897. He was approximately 14 years old, which was remarkable for a dog of his size, and he had spent his final years sleeping on the platform in the dugout above the central tiles where the heat was most consistent. He died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March in his usual spot on the warm boards above the tile that had kept him warm since the October day Erna had found him at the dump, and he had refused to stop following her. She carried him outside and buried him beside the entrance to the dugout in the earth that had kept them both alive. Tobias carved the headstone from a piece of limestone. He did not ask what to write. He knew what to write. He found us when we needed finding. Erna stood at the grave after Tobias went inside, and she put her hand on the stone and felt the cold of it and remembered the day she had walked away from a rubbish heap and a thin dog with one ear up and one ear down had decided not to let her. She said thank you for everything. By 1890, 22 houses in the Elkhorn area used floor heating systems based on the design that Erna had built from Dietrich's knowledge. She had taught every one of them herself patiently without charge, in the conviction that the knowledge was not hers to keep. It had come to her from a man who had gathered it from ancient sources and carried it across an ocean and pressed it into her memory across 40 years of ordinary evenings. The least she could do was keep it moving. In 1941, a researcher from the University of Nebraska drove out from Lincoln with a notebook and a thermometer and the practical skepticism that serious academic work requires. He had read about this structure in county land records and wanted to see it for himself. He descended the entrance ramp. He let his eyes adjust to the dim interior. He saw the earthen walls still standing after 58 years, the cottonwood roof beams still solid overhead, the sleeping platform with its worn boards, the tile channel running from the firebox opening to the chimney exit, 14 feet of buried clay still forming a continuous path through the Nebraska earth. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the floor. He held it there. Then he lifted his hand and looked at it and wrote one sentence in his notebook before anything else. He wrote that the system was fully functional. He wrote that the temperature was 51 degrees. He wrote that it was exactly as designed. He sat back on his duhio in the dim, warm space and looked at the tiles and the stones and the earthen walls and thought about the woman who had built this in the autumn of 1883 with $9 and a dead man's plans and not a single person in the world who believed she would survive to see spring. The warmth rising from the floor was patient and steady and faithful. It did not know that 58 years had passed. It did not know that the woman who had built the system was gone, that the bulk who had slept above the central tiles was gone, that the young blacksmith who had walked 8 miles in a blizzard was an old man now. It did not know any of these things. It only knew how to move through clay and stone and rise through the earth and warm whatever was above it. It had been doing this since October of 1883, and it intended to continue. The earth never lies. It keeps its promises, always has, always will.